It began with a folder that should not have existed, dust-coated, unnumbered, and buried deep within a British War Office archive, slated for destruction in 1974. Inside were 6 photographs of uniformed men standing in a forest clearing, their insignia obscured, their faces blurred by exposure, and a single, typed heading stamped Eclipse. What followed were memoranda, fragments of decoded signals, and one chilling annotation in red pencil. Division 100, status unknown since April 1945. The file's discovery reopened a question intelligence agencies had quietly ignored for decades. How does an entire mechanized division vanish without a trace? And why had every record of its existence been systematically erased from both Allied and German archives? Chapter 1. Operation Eclipse, the vanishing of Division 100. The earliest trace of Division 100 appears in Wehrmacht deployment rosters dated February 1945, an anomalous entry listing 100. Panzergrenadier Division, Ruhrgebiet sector, yet no official unit of that designation existed in standard German army registries. Cross-referencing field reports from the same period reveals scattered mentions of an unidentified armored column operating near Wuppertal and Essen under the call sign Eclipse. The division's alleged commander, Oberst Heinrich Wolf, never appeared in post-war interrogation records or Red Cross prisoner lists. According to a captured Enigma transmission decrypted at Bletchley Park on April 7, 1945, a group Wolf was ordered to secure the cargo and proceed to the alternate axis via Thuringia, a route that bypassed Allied lines entirely. No follow-up message was ever received. By early April, the Ruhr pocket had become a cauldron of encirclement. Allied intelligence tracked every German division trapped inside, yet Division 100 appeared, moved, and then disappeared like a ghost formation. Major Charles Everett of the US 79th Infantry Division later recalled intercepting a column of Panther tanks near Bochum, bearing no unit insignia, painted entirely in matte black with white numbering crossed out by fresh camouflage. "They didn't fire, didn't flee," he said in a 1963 oral history. "They just drove past like we weren't there, like they had orders we weren't supposed to know about." 2 hours later, his platoon found the same road cratered and blocked by mines, as though someone had erased the convoy's path behind them. In the chaos of collapsing fronts, confusion was common, but the sudden administrative silence surrounding Division 100 was not. The US Army's G2 intelligence section recorded the disappearance of over 3,000 soldiers, 120 vehicles, and 14 panzers between April 6 and 9. No prisoners, no wreckage, no confirmed deaths. British Field Security Section 240, tasked with documenting captured German units, noted the absence as statistically impossible. When the report was filed to SHAF headquarters in Reims, it was immediately marked restricted for command eyes only and subsequently omitted from the 1946 War Department Summary of Operations. The first real clue surfaced 7 years later, during the early years of the Cold War. A declassified OSS memorandum dated November 12, 1952, found in a mislabeled box at the National Archives, referenced an internal inquiry labeled Eclipse Blacklight. The memo contained an excerpt of a testimony from a German engineer, Dr. Erich Weissmann, who claimed to have been attached to a special convoy transporting uranium oxide from industrial facilities in Essen toward a southern objective under SS protection. Weissmann's statement, recorded during Operation Paperclip interviews, was abruptly redacted after page 3. The unredacted portion ends with a line typed in English. "They said it was too late for Berlin. Our future was in the tunnels." The tunnels likely referred to a network of subterranean complexes stretching beneath Thuringia, connected to Project Riese, Hitler's secret mountain installations designed for weapons research and last-ditch headquarters. Soviet forces overran the region by late April, yet no record exists of Division 100 surrendering or engaging in combat there. When questioned during the Nuremberg trials, former SS General Hans Kammler, the man responsible for the Riese complexes and many of the Reich's secret weapons programs, was reported dead by suicide near Prague on May 9, 1945. Yet in 1967, NATO counterintelligence unearthed a Luftwaffe flight log recovered from a derelict airfield near Salzburg, signed H. Kammler. The document detailed a special cargo transfer Eclipse Priority, dated April 12, 1945, 3 days after Division 100 vanished. Researchers who attempted to piece together the timeline found themselves caught in a bureaucratic fog. Each mention of Eclipse was buried beneath layers of classification, often marked not to be released to foreign nationals. When independent historian Dr. Margaret Heller petitioned the British Ministry of Defence for access to post-war field reports in 1974, her request was denied under National Security Exemption 12A, a clause typically reserved for nuclear materials or intelligence cooperation with foreign agencies. There are no missing divisions, the official reply stated. Any assertion to the contrary originates from enemy propaganda. 2 months later, Dr. Heller's home office was burglarized. Her research notes burned in what police described as an accidental electrical fire, declassified. Allied photo reconnaissance from early April 1945 shows unusual patterns of movement in the Thuringian forest. Columns of vehicles traveling at night without lights, their routes aligning with known Reese tunnel sites such as Jonastal and Waxenberg Hill. In 1989, after German reunification, East German Stasi archives revealed further anomalies. One file, labeled B472145, Division 100 Bewegungen, contained Soviet reports from May 1945, describing unidentified armored transports moving south from Eisenach under American supervision. If true, this would suggest elements of Division 100 were absorbed into Western intelligence custody, possibly as part of Operation Safe Haven, the post-war effort to secure Nazi assets and personnel before Soviet capture. What exactly was being transported? Conflicting accounts mention uranium crates, others speak of biological containers, and one Soviet field report references cylindrical pressure vessels bearing high radiation warnings. American engineers working under Operation Alsos confirmed the seizure of uranium oxide from industrial sites in Germany, but none officially tied to Division 100. The British National Archives contain one reference, buried in the minutes of a 1948 Joint Intelligence Committee meeting. Eclipse cargo successfully integrated into transatlantic technical program. Public disclosure not advised. The minutes were signed only by initials, CDJ, believed to belong to Charles Douglas Jackson, a psychological warfare specialist later employed at the White House. By the 1960s, the story had faded into rumor. Yet former US Army intelligence officer Colonel Edward Marlowe, in a private letter to his son before his death in 1971, wrote, "We found them, but not where you'd expect. They weren't prisoners, they were partners." The meaning of this statement remains unclear, but it aligns disturbingly with Declassified, CIA reports confirming that dozens of former SS scientists and engineers were quietly relocated to the United States through paperclip between 1945 and 1950, their identities altered and records erased. In 1992, a German journalist named Lucas Reinhardt uncovered fragments of a burned Wehrmacht logbook from a bunker excavation near Kassel. Among its surviving pages was an entry dated April 8, 1945. Division 100 ordered south, cargo priority 1. Kammler present. Orders from Führerhauptquartier confirmed by cipher Eclipse. Forensic analysis authenticated the paper, ink, and typewriter model as consistent with wartime materials. Within months of publication, Reinhardt's story was discredited in mainstream media as revisionist speculation. Yet the original documents were never produced again. Reinhardt himself was found dead 2 years later in his apartment from an apparent gas leak. Today, the official record still lists Division 100 as non-existent. No graves, no surrender lists, no names carved into memorials. The only surviving trace lies in the classified corridors of NATO's Historical Intelligence Review, where a single page labeled Eclipse Blacklight remains sealed under top-level security restrictions. The text, barely legible through redacted lines, reads, Division 100 executed final directive. Extraction successful. Cargo delivered as instructed. Location remains secure. History records countless disappearances amid the fog of war. But the vanishing of Division 100 was not chaos. It was orchestration. Every erased log, every destroyed photograph, every vanished witness points to a deliberate operation designed to remove something or someone from history itself. The silence that followed was not forgetfulness, it was protection. And in the archives that still bear the code word Eclipse, The truth remains locked away, waiting for the day when secrecy finally fails. Chapter 2: The Red Files of Königsberg. When Soviet troops stormed Königsberg in April 1945, the city was already a graveyard of archives and stone. Fire had devoured its libraries, and artillery had buried its cathedrals. Amid the ruins of the Prussian Academy, once the pride of East Prussia, a Red Army engineering detachment discovered a sealed chamber 40 feet below ground level. The entrance was hidden behind a collapsed stairwell, reinforced with concrete and rigged with primitive explosives. Inside were metal crates, each marked with the Imperial Reichsadler and a serial code beginning with RAK. The lead officer, Captain Sergei Antonov of the 3rd Belarusian Front, recorded in his field log, unusual storage, documents and cylinders, not ordinary munitions. German scientists identified by SS tattoos. One executed at scene. The materials were transferred to Smolensk under armed guard before being redirected to Moscow. None of Antonov's men ever saw the contents again. For decades, what became known as the Red Files existed only as a whispered rumor among Soviet archivists. Officially, the crates were said to contain routine military communications seized from East Prussia. But in 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, fragments from a partially declassified Lubyanka inventory list surfaced, referencing an acquisition coded Roter Akt, nicht öffnen, translated as Red File, do not open. The accompanying description read simply, Biological-Psychological Correspondence, German-Soviet Cooperation, 1940-1944. Western intelligence analysts immediately took interest. The year 1940 was significant. It predated the Nazi invasion of the USSR, suggesting covert collaboration that contradicted the accepted wartime narrative. Further evidence emerged from the memoir of Major Pyotr Levchenko, a KGB archivist who defected to West Germany in 1978. In an unpublished manuscript later smuggled into Switzerland, Levchenko described cataloguing the Roter Akt collection in 1953. He claimed the files detailed exchanges between German SS research branches and Soviet military institutes in Leningrad, focusing on psychotronic and neurophysiological experimentation. One document, according to Levchenko, outlined a joint program called Project Winterson, a study of sensory deprivation, hypnosis and radiation exposure on prisoners sourced from occupied Poland and the Baltic states. It was not medicine, he wrote, it was control, testing how far a man's mind could be broken and rebuilt to obey. The Soviet Ministry of Defense denied the existence of both the Red Files and Winterson, branding Levchenko a fabricator and traitor. Yet, in 1994, a research team at the University of Tartu uncovered microfilm reels mislabeled under meteorological surveys. The film contained laboratory photographs showing German and Cyrillic captions on the same negative strip. One image depicted a medical table surrounded by men in mixed uniforms, German tunics and Soviet coats, with a chalkboard. Behind them, bearing the words, Reactions Protocol. WS Forensic Dating placed the photographs in early 1941, mere months before Operation Barbarossa. A faded note at the bottom read, Transfer results to Königsberg facility, per Dr. Bruckner and Lieutenant Donskoy. Both names appeared nowhere in public archives. However, a classified Allied interrogation transcript from 1946 listed a Dr. Hermann Bruckner as missing, presumed deceased, last seen at Königsberg University under SS supervision. By the mid-1950s, the Red Files had been locked away under Stalin's direct orders. The Lubyanka catalogue number assigned, LX 11452, remained untouched until after his death. During the brief period of political thaw that followed, several boxes were quietly destroyed. Surviving documents were transferred to a secret repository in Sverdlovsk, where they remained under the jurisdiction of the Soviet 12th Main Directorate, responsible for nuclear, chemical, and biological programs. A surviving receipt discovered in 1996 bore the signature of General Igor Kurilov, then head of Directorate 12. The notation in the margin read, Biological archive received intact. Psychological experiments continue under new designation. Project Duga. That term would later resurface in unrelated contexts. The infamous over-the-horizon radar array known to NATO as the Russian woodpecker. But the repetition of the name in separate classified programs raised suspicion. that Duga may have been more than just an electronic defense initiative. Western agencies made several attempts to locate the lost archive. In 1960, a CIA operation under the codename Silver Dust targeted a Soviet courier believed to be transferring the Königsberg files from Moscow to Minsk. The courier's train derailed under unexplained circumstances, killing all aboard. When recovery teams arrived, the sealed briefcases were missing. 3 days later, a diplomatic cable from the US Embassy in Warsaw reported sightings of foreign men in Red Army uniforms scavenging the wreckage. No trace of the documents was ever found. The CIA closed the file, noting, "Objective neutralized, assets compromised." After the Soviet collapse, access to former KGB storage depots revealed further irregularities. Researchers at the Russian State Military Archive identified an entry for Object K345, recovered Königsberg materials, classified Level 7. When investigators requested to examine the boxes, the authorization was rescinded within 48 hours, citing national security implications of biological nature. One of the archivists involved later confided to a BBC journalist that the boxes emitted a sharp chemical odor and were accompanied by radiation hazard warnings, unusual for paper files. "It was as if the documents themselves were treated," he said, "sealed in lead containers, covered with wax, and marked with a black sun emblem." A clue to the contents emerged in 2002, when a declassified East German Stasi document surfaced, referencing the files under codename Schattenfeld, Field of Shadows. The document suggested that during the 1950s, the red files had been microfilmed and partially replicated for use in Soviet psychological conditioning experiments conducted in Dresden and Riga. It listed specific test groups, including prisoners from the Gulag system and captured Western operatives. A notation at the bottom read, "Data origin, Königsberg, Rota Act, 1945 acquisition." Western historians reviewing the document noted its chilling precision. Each test subject's reaction time, breakdown point, and survival rate was logged with clinical detachment. One entry stood out. Test subject 47B displayed total compliance after 62 hours deprivation, no external coercion required. The corresponding experiment ID matched one from the 1941 Königsberg records. It implied continuity across 2 decades. German wartime research quietly absorbed and continued under Soviet administration. The moral line between victor and vanquished had blurred into bureaucracy. To this day, official Russian historians deny that any such cooperation ever existed. The Lubyanka archive, when queried, returns the same response to every Freedom of Information request. No materials found under designation Rota Act. Yet satellite imagery from 1978, analyzed by Western intelligence, reveals fresh excavation near the ruins of the old Prussian academy. The dig, conducted by uniformed engineers, was abruptly halted. The area was later fenced and converted into a municipal park. Ground-penetrating radar scans taken decades later suggest the presence of a reinforced chamber, still sealed, still intact. The red files of Königsberg occupy a grey zone between myth and classified truth. Each fragment, the microfilms, the memoirs, the blurred photographs, points to a hidden history of collaboration and human experimentation that neither side wishes to claim. The absence of proof, maintained through silence and disappearance, has become its own form of evidence. And somewhere beneath the reconstructed streets of modern Kaliningrad, beneath layers of Soviet concrete and post-war reconstruction, the vault that once housed the red files may still lie untouched, waiting for a world willing to confront what was buried there in 1945. Chapter 3. Ghost Convoy, the Baltic Incident. In the final, desperate week of the European War, on the night of May 3, 1945, 6 German U-boats left the harbour of Gottenhafen, now Gdynia, Poland, under radio silence. The Kriegsmarine War Diary for that date lists no such departure. Yet Allied radar logs from the Baltic Command recorded an unidentified submarine group moving westward at 2200 hours, maintaining an unusually tight formation. Their course led into the dark waters between Bornholm and Gotland. Of those 6 vessels, only 3 would ever be detected again. And even those were found scuttled and abandoned, their hatches sealed from the inside. The others were simply gone, erased from the sea and from official record. The mission's codename revealed later through partial decryption, was Unternehmen Seeschatten, Operation Sea Shadow. British intelligence first noticed anomalies in early 1946, when a Swedish fisherman named Oskar Lundström hauled up a corroded steel cylinder off the coast of Gotland. Inside were reels of waterlogged microfilm, fragments of German naval codebooks, and a list of Soviet diplomatic frequencies dated April 28, 1945, barely days before Hitler's death. The material was quietly confiscated by Swedish authorities and handed to the British naval attaché in Stockholm. One memo, now declassified, described detailed transmission logs suggesting coordination between Kriegsmarine Command and an unidentified foreign recipient, possibly neutral or allied. The find was classified Most Secret and filed under Admiralty Reference Number ADM 223741, labelled Ghost Convoy. A post-war interrogation of U-boat officers at Minden internment camp produced further clues. A surviving radio operator from U-3506, a Type 21 submarine, recalled that special cargo had been loaded in Gotenhafen under direct SS supervision. It was not ammunition, he insisted. They used cranes and wore protective gear. Even the captain was not told what it was. The order had come directly from General Hans Kammler, the same figure associated with the disappearance of Division 100. The operator remembered one phrase repeated by the SS overseer: "For the next war, not this one." Allied analysts speculated that the cargo may have been part of the Reich's late-war nuclear or chemical research effort, though no proof ever surfaced. Swedish naval archives reveal that on May 5, 1945, 2 days after the convoy's departure, coastal listening stations intercepted faint distress signals on frequency 11.750 MHz. The Morse code identified U1115 and repeated the phrase "Cargo beschädigt, nicht öffnen." Cargo damaged, do not open. The transmission ceased abruptly after 20 seconds. When Swedish patrol vessels searched the area, they found only debris, oil slicks, fragments of wood, and an empty crate lid marked with the Ahnenerbe insignia, the occult research division of the SS. The incident was officially recorded as an unknown naval loss. By 1951, during NATO's early intelligence sharing programs, a classified Royal Navy assessment known as Report No. 74 Baltic Residual Operations revisited the case. It concluded that at least 2 of the U-boats had likely reached Soviet-controlled waters. One entry noted that Soviet salvage divers working near the Latvian coast in late 1946 recovered metallic containers exhibiting contamination, consistent with radioactive materials. Western intelligence never confirmed the claim, but subsequent Soviet secrecy around the site suggested something had indeed been found. The area near Liepāja was later designated a restricted military zone for nearly 2 decades. In 1963, a Polish defector provided another thread. Formerly attached to the Gdynia Port Administration, he described witnessing the loading of sealed steel drums onto U-boats under the supervision of both SS and uniformed civilians speaking fluent English. The presence of non-German personnel during the Reich's final days was highly unusual. His testimony, declassified in 1998, included the remark, "They weren't fleeing. They were delivering something, and they had permission to leave." Western analysts drew a disturbing implication, that Operation Seeschatten may have been a transfer, not an escape. The Reich, in its death throes, might have been negotiating its scientific assets with the very powers preparing to divide Germany. In the 1970s, commercial divers exploring the wreck of an unknown submarine off Gotland at a depth of 112 meters reported finding a sealed hatch welded from the outside. Inside, through a small viewport, they saw stacked crates bearing the unmistakable Ahnenerbe emblem and stenciled alphanumeric codes beginning with WS. The discovery was immediately reported to Swedish authorities. Within a week, NATO's Maritime Command restricted the coordinates, citing unexploded ordnance risk. Access remains prohibited to this day. 2 years later, the lead diver, Anders Holm, was found dead in his home from carbon monoxide poisoning, ruled accidental. His dive logs disappeared from storage shortly afterward. Documents uncovered in the late 1990s in the German Federal Archives indicate that WS may have stood for Wissenschaftliche Sammlung scientific, Collection, a term used for SS research shipments. Among the papers was a manifest from the Ahnenerbe Institute in Berlin, dated April 25, 1945, listing anthropological and biological materials destined for maritime evacuation via Baltic, route Seeschatten. The signature field read, Dr. Kurt Heismeyer, a physician later executed for human experimentation at Neuengamme concentration camp. Yet the manifest bore another name beneath his, Lieutenant S. Donskoy, the same Soviet liaison noted decades later in the Königsberg Red Files. The overlap suggested that Seeschatten, Königsberg, and even the Ries facilities may have been fragments of one larger continuum. A scientific exodus camouflaged as military retreat. The Baltic Sea itself has preserved its secrets with chilling efficiency. In 2010, sonar imaging surveys for a Swedish marine archaeology project rediscovered a wreck matching the dimensions of a Type 21 U-boat near the same coordinates as the 1963 NATO exclusion zone. The vessel's hull showed no signs of combat damage, only deliberate scuttling. An unmanned submersible camera captured a brief image of an intact insignia near the conning tower. 3 interlocked rings forming a triangle, a symbol never used by the Kriegsmarine. Some historians speculate it represented a covert SS division dedicated to post-war continuity operations. Others dismiss it as coincidence. Before further exploration could occur, the Swedish government renewed the protected site designation, citing environmental hazards. In 2014, fragments of Soviet naval correspondence were unearthed, in Riga describing recovered technological materials from German underwater cargo. The materials were said to have been transported to Kaliningrad under the authority of the Second Baltic Fleet. The documents also mention foreign advisors, present during analysis, identified only by initials, CDJ and EM, possibly referring to Western observers or defected German scientists. One note concludes, the technology cannot be replicated. Recommend containment. After translation, the same file was marked destroyed in 1958. The mystery of Operation Seeschatten persists not merely because of what was lost, but because of how carefully it was erased. Every surviving reference is buried beneath conflicting censorship, from Soviet secrecy to NATO classification. It is the silence, repeated and deliberate, that gives the incident its haunting gravity. Somewhere beneath the Baltic waves lies evidence of a transaction that bridged enemies, that blurred the lines between surrender and cooperation. And in the unmarked graves of steel and salt water, the ghosts of those U-boats still wait, their sealed cargoes untouched, their purpose still unspoken. The sea has kept its promise better than any archive could. Chapter 4. Project Morgenrot, the Alps Enigma. In the final winter of the Reich, deep within the Austrian Alps, a vast network of tunnels was carved into limestone and granite. Locals whispered of trucks rumbling through the night, guarded by SS units without insignia, their license plates removed. The site was known only by its code. Project Morgenrot, Morning Red. Unlike the better-known Project Ries in Silesia, Morgenrot never appeared in surviving German engineering records. Its existence was reconstructed from fragments, declassified US Army documents, testimonies of post-war prisoners, and a series of blueprints recovered from an abandoned Luftwaffe archive in Innsbruck. Each bore the same stamp, Sonderbauvorhaben, MR, Special Construction Task, MR. The initials MR appeared again decades later in a secret US Air Force report on aerospace propulsion experiments. The connection was never officially acknowledged. According to an interrogation record dated June 11, 1945, an SS engineer named Otto Keil, captured near Salzburg, described supervising deep storage for experimental engines at an alpine site accessible only by a camouflaged road near Obertraun. His words were transcribed by a US Counterintelligence Corps officer. It was not a weapons depot. It was a laboratory. We tested propulsion units unlike anything built before. When asked who authorized the work, Keil replied, Kammler, always Kammler. The name recurred like a ghost across every secret project of the Reich. V-2 rockets, jet aircraft, underground factories, and now it seemed Morgenrot. In July 1945, Allied survey teams combed the Dachstein mountain range, guided by captured maps. They found collapsed entrances, ventilation shafts, and scorched cables. Radiation counters registered faint anomalies near the deepest boreholes. Among the rubble were scattered technical manuals referencing plasma dynamische Versuchsapparaturen, plasma dynamic test devices, terms decades ahead of conventional wartime technology. One report from the US Army Corps of Engineers, classified until 1995, stated, "Site exhibits evidence of high-temperature experiments inconsistent with chemical propulsion." The discovery was quietly folded into the paperclip program. The site itself was sealed under concrete. For years, Project Morgenrot vanished from public record. It re-emerged briefly in 1958, when a French Alpine survey expedition stumbled upon reinforced steel doors high in a glacier crevasse near Obertraun. The team's photographs, published in a small geological journal, showed doors marked with faded SS runes and a radiation trefoil, anachronistic, since that symbol was standardized only after 1946. Within months, the area was fenced off by Austrian authorities, officially citing avalanche risk. In truth, NATO intelligence had intervened. An internal memorandum from 1959, discovered by journalist Anton Giese decades later, read, Site MR4 under US jurisdiction, ongoing research integration with Red Horizon program. The phrase Red Horizon appears nowhere in public archives, but aerospace historians have linked it to early ion, propulsion and classified anti-gravity, field research conducted by the US Air Force in the 1960s. Otto Keil was released from custody in 1948 and quietly relocated to the United States. His naturalization file lists his occupation as aerospace consultant, employed by a contractor later absorbed into Bell Aircraft. In a 1961 letter to his former colleague in Linz, Keil wrote cryptically, "They built it again, but they don't call it Morgenrot." 2 years later, Keil disappeared. His apartment in Vienna was found undisturbed except for a single handwritten note left on his desk. It was never German. It was found. The note has been authenticated, though its meaning remains unclear. Some interpret it as a reference to technology discovered rather than invented. Decades later, Austrian environmental engineers performing geological surveys near Obertraun detected artificial caverns matching wartime blueprints. Ground-penetrating radar revealed sealed corridors stretching over a kilometer beneath the ice. Temperature readings suggested an ongoing internal power source, an impossibility if the site had been abandoned for over 70 years. When the Austrian Ministry of Defense dispatched a team in 2004, they reported electromagnetic interference that disabled all communication equipment within a half-kilometer radius. Their findings were never released. Local newspapers received anonymous warnings not to publish details of the expedition. US Freedom of Information Act requests filed in 2009 for Project Morgenrot returned with the standard denial phrase, "No records responsive to your query." Yet metadata within related declassified files revealed cross-references to Operation Paperclip Site 12, Alpine Materials. One memorandum, declassified by error, noted transfer of Morgenrot research assets to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base completed. 1950, Wright-Patterson, the same base linked to numerous Cold War reverse engineering programs. When Austrian historian Dr. Friedrich Steiner requested access to American archives, he was informed that all relevant documents were destroyed in 1973 under standard retention policy. He later received an unsigned envelope containing a photocopy of an engineering schematic. The diagram depicted a circular chamber labeled Testenlage A, surrounded by magnets and rotating rings. At the bottom was a single word in English, reactor. Skeptics have long dismissed Morgenrot as a myth born from wartime paranoia, but scattered eyewitness accounts tell a different story. In 1946, a US Army photographer stationed near Hallstatt reported hearing low, rhythmic hums emanating from the sealed tunnels at night, as if machinery still operated beneath the mountain. Locals in the 1950s spoke of strange lights flickering beneath the glacier, blue-white glows that pulsed in regular intervals. Even today, mountaineers claim compasses behave erratically near the old site. While such phenomena can be explained by natural magnetism, the frequency and persistence of reports remain peculiar. The most compelling evidence came from a 1987 Austrian National Police file labeled Obertraun Incident. 2 hikers disappeared after entering a restricted tunnel entrance during summer thaw. Search teams found their equipment and a melted metal canteen fused into the rock. Radiation readings were elevated but not lethal. The official cause of death was listed as environmental exposure. The file was closed within weeks. In 1990, an anonymous informant delivered to a Vienna newspaper a roll of undeveloped film allegedly taken inside one of the tunnels. The images, grainy and discolored, showed a vast circular chamber with a central metallic structure surrounded by scaffolding. The informant vanished before identification. Today, the area remains off-limits, guarded by Austrian military police under the pretext of avalanche prevention. Satellite imagery shows no installations, yet infrared scans occasionally reveal localized heat signatures inconsistent with natural geology. What purpose Project Morgenrot served, weaponization, propulsion, or something stranger, may never be confirmed. But the evidence suggests it was far more than an experimental lab. It was a continuation, a bridge between wartime desperation and Cold War ambition. Every attempt to erase it has instead amplified its legend. Somewhere beneath the frozen silence of the Dachstein, concrete corridors may still hum with residual power. Whether that energy was of human origin or something repurposed from a discovery the Reich never understood, no one can say. The documents that remain, the sealed blueprints, and the repeated redactions tell one consistent story. Morgenrot was real, and it was buried alive. Chapter 5. The Silent Directive. Washington File. 47B. Washington, D.C., Spring 1949. In the aftermath of victory and reconstruction, amid marble corridors filled with celebration of peace, a single document crossed the desks of a select few within the Department of Defense. It bore no title, only a classification marking. Top Secret. 47B. Silent Directive. The memorandum, typed on yellowed carbon paper and signed in heavy black ink, contained one concise instruction: suppress disclosure of all industrial, financial, and technological collaborations between wartime Axis research entities and US corporate affiliates. Continuation under new charter permitted. Beneath the formal language, the implications were staggering. The same corporations that had equipped Allied forces were, in some cases, the same ones that had financed their enemies' laboratories. And now, under Cold War urgency, those wartime connections were being quietly resurrected. The origins of File 47B trace back to Operation Safe Haven, an Allied intelligence program launched in 1944 to track Nazi assets hidden across neutral territories. Officially, Safe Haven aimed to prevent the economic resurgence of the Third Reich through offshore networks in Switzerland, Portugal, and Argentina. Unofficially, Safe Haven evolved into something far more complex: an asset acquisition campaign. Intelligence operatives discovered that German industrialists and scientists were being protected, not prosecuted, because their expertise and capital were deemed strategically indispensable. The Silent Directive was the bureaucratic mechanism to ensure this process continued unchallenged and unseen. In the summer of 1949, a low-ranking clerk named Harold Whitman was tasked with indexing archival correspondence between the War Department and the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency. Among the boxes, he found multiple memos stamped 47BXT. One letter, dated September 13, 1946, detailed the post-war transfer of patents seized from IG Farben Siemens and Messerschmitt subsidiaries to American firms through neutral intermediaries in Zurich. The memo listed code names like Project Solaris and Operation Ascendant, both later revealed to involve aeronautical and chemical research. Attached to one page was a typed note: reintegration complete. Original German documentation to be destroyed per Directive 47B. Whitman's curiosity cost him his clearance. Within weeks, he was reassigned to Okinawa under an unrelated administrative error. By the early 1950s, American defense contractors began producing technologies years ahead of their projected timelines. Advanced jet turbines, synthetic fuels, early computer systems. Many bore uncanny resemblance to German wartime research, yet none of the original engineers appeared in public records. A declassified State Department memorandum from 1954 titled Industrial Continuity Measures reveals a hidden clause authorizing private sector continuation of confiscated Axis research for national security purposes. The memo included a redacted reference to psychophysiological testing materials acquired Königsberg 1945, linking it indirectly to the Red Files. The bureaucratic web connecting Europe's shadow laboratories to American industry had been woven under the guise of Cold War necessity. Investigative. Journalist Robert L. Thorne stumbled upon a surviving copy of File 47B while researching economic war crimes in the 1970s. His unpublished manuscript, The Silent Directive: How America Bought the Reich, described a network of Swiss holding companies laundering patents and scientific staff into the United States. He wrote of meetings between former SS scientists and corporate executives in Basel, brokered by intermediaries tied to the CIA's Office of Policy Coordination. The directive, Thorne wrote, was not just about secrecy, it was about ownership. Days before the book was to go to print, Thorne was found dead in a motel outside Baltimore, an apparent suicide. The manuscript disappeared from his publisher's archive. Only a photocopied introduction survived, later obtained by congressional investigators. In it, Thorne quoted a line allegedly from the directive itself: "Public ignorance is a form of stability." In 1972, the Senate Subcommittee on Multinational Corporations reopened investigations into wartime profiteering. Staffers stumbled upon repeated references to Directive 47B in Commerce Department files. When subpoenas were issued, dozens of documents were suddenly reclassified or reported missing. One Senate aide, under anonymity, described being shown a heavily redacted briefing marked 47B, Safe Haven Extension. The briefing included lists of strategic scientists, individuals believed to have been transferred from Germany, Austria, and occupied territories under Operation Paperclip, then reassigned to private defense contractors. At least 12 of those names corresponded to engineers previously listed as deceased in post-war Allied archives. What disturbed the investigators most was not the existence of File 47B, but its endurance. Its last known revision, dated 1968, was signed by a familiar name, C.D. Jackson, former OSS officer and psychological warfare advisor to President Eisenhower. Jackson's involvement linked the Silent Directive directly to the broader architecture of Cold War propaganda and technological competition. One marginal note beside his signature read, "Industrial secrecy vital to morale. Public inquiry unnecessary." The file's final paragraph was even more chilling. The continuity of knowledge outweighs the cost of origin. In 1981, a Freedom of Information request by the National Archives returned a denial citing executive exemption, foreign intelligence partnerships. But the denial letter itself contained a clerical error, an attachment misfiled from a Defense Logistics Memorandum referencing Project Eclipse archives, cross-reference to File 47B. The reappearance of the Eclipse, codename linked to the vanished Division 100, suggested that multiple secret recovery operations from Europe to the United States were components of one long-running directive to secure and conceal the Third Reich's technological remnants under new authority. Former intelligence officers who later spoke anonymously to researchers hinted that 47B had effectively become a living policy renewed automatically by successor agencies. One retired CIA analyst summarized it bluntly. It wasn't about Nazis, it was about patents, data, and the people who could use them. The moral lines blurred when the Cold War began. Evidence supports his claim. Between 1950 and 1970, dozens of defense contracts were traced to shell companies founded by émigré scientists with unverifiable wartime records. Their inventions, ranging from jet propulsion to medical radiation, became cornerstones of American supremacy, built upon knowledge extracted under the Silent Directive's protection. In 1999, during a routine archival audit, a single surviving carbon copy of File 47B surfaced in a mislabeled microfilm reel stored at the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis. The document was immediately seized by Department of Defense officials, citing improper classification release. The archivist who discovered it, Ellen Morse, later stated under oath that the file's heading read, Subject: Consolidation of Technical Assets, Continuation Policy. She recalled a specific line that chilled her. All materials obtained via Eclipse, Sea Shatten, Winterson, and Morgenrot to remain compartmentalized indefinitely. Morse was dismissed 2 months later for procedural misconduct. The Silent Directive remains officially unacknowledged. No copy is publicly available. No agency admits custody, and every trace of its implementation has been systematically redacted from history. But the technological leaps of the 1950s and 60s, the ones credited to American innovation, bear the fingerprints of older, darker origins. Each vanished project, from Division 100 to the Königsberg archives, from the Baltic ghost convoy to the frozen laboratories of the Alps, finds its terminus in Washington's bureaucratic shadow. If File 47B truly existed, it was not merely a policy, it was the blueprint of a quiet assimilation, a directive to repurpose the machinery of war into the engine of peace, while burying its provenance beneath patriotism and progress. The directive's silence endures, woven into the very systems it created, and somewhere, in the sealed vaults of the Pentagon's archival annex, a box labeled 47B Silent Directive, Do Not Duplicate, may still rest, its pages yellowed, its ink fading, its truth preserved precisely because no one dares to open it. For every buried file, there remains a question that refuses to fade. Operation Eclipse, the Königsberg archives, the Baltic convoy, the Morgenrot tunnels, and the Silent Directive, all threads of a single tapestry too vast to be coincidence. Each discovery revealed another layer of silence, another deliberate omission, until truth itself became classified. Were these erasures acts of protection or concealment? History, it seems, is not written by the victors, but by those who control the archives. Somewhere, in the locked basements of forgotten ministries and sealed military vaults, the rest of the story waits, its ink fading, its secrets still guarded, its consequences not yet complete.